video, we're going to take a look at the basics about employment and unemployment. And a lot of this is going to be vocabulary. It's going to be some just terms that we're going to use. So if some students have told me over the years that maybe some flashcards are helpful with these, but we're going to do our best using this flow chart that I've constructed for you. So the first thing to observe is you've got a total population of a country. And in the United States, that's 330 million or so people. Economists categorize them into two groups. Either you're in the civilian labor force or you're not. Pretty simple. So either you are 16 and over, not institutionalized, not in the military or school, and you're working or actively looking for a job, that makes you in the civilian labor force. So, for example, if you're a full-time college student, right, and you don't have a job and you're 22, then you are not in the labor force because you are in military or school, right? If you are 15, you're not in the labor force. If you're in the military, you're not in the civilian labor force, right? And so beyond that, we can kind of see that there are multiple other categories. Within the not in the labor force group, there are three groups of people that we're going to take a look at. But let's start actually with just the civilian labor force. First, you've got employed people and you've got unemployed people. And what we'll say about unemployed people is that first, they are not employed. So if anything is true about the employed column, then that means you're employed, so you can't be both. And it means that if you are considered unemployed, it means you actively looked for work, a job, in the last 4 weeks. Right? So you had to actively look for work in the last 4 weeks. You had to look online, you had to put in an application, that kind of stuff. You couldn't just be browsing either. You actually had to apply for a job or go for an interview or something like that. Now, to be employed, right? And so you can see that before I move on, you can see that that's a fairly narrow definition, right? There are lots of people who would not fit as unemployed in the kind of normal definition. There are three subtypes of unemployed that I'll just point out. There are frictional, structural, and cyclical. And all three of these are considered unemployed. We're going to talk in the next video about what these three things mean. But everyone who's unemployed is one of these three. They can't be more than one, but they're one of those three. Now, employed people, they meet these characteristics, and at least one of these characteristics. Work 1+ hour for pay. Right? So if you worked an hour for pay, then you count as employed. Or if you were self-employed, even if you didn't take a salary for 1+ hour in the last week. If you worked in a family business, and for this, you had to work 15+ hours, even for no pay. Or you're not at work this week, but you still have a job. So for example, if you were sick, or if you were on strike, right? Or if you were on vacation or something, you're still counted as employed. Now, within this group, you could imagine there's a lot of people who are employed, but they're not doing that well. So we'd say there are these people called part-time for economic reasons. Part-time, PTERs. Peters. So these are employed people. That's the first thing to know. But they would like full-time, but can't get it. And we'd say for economic reasons. For economic reasons. There are a lot of people who are part-time, they'd like a full-time job, but they can't because they're taking care of grandma, right? That person is not a Peter. A person who's part-time and they'd like full-time, but they're not full-time because they're too sick. Nope, not a Peter. You have to not be able to get that full-time job for economic reasons. And that's a special category. We pay attention to these people because it tells us there's some slack in the labor force if there's a lot of Peters, right? Now, let's take a look at the not in the labor force group. There's three groups within this. First, there's the marginally attached. And first to know about them is they are not in the labor force. Not in the labor force, okay? They would like a job. They would like a job. So if you survey them, they'd say, oh yeah, I'd like a job. And they looked looked in the last 12 months, but not in the last 4 weeks. So in other words, they're awfully close to being unemployed. They just haven't looked in the last 4 weeks. And that immediately pulls them out of being unemployed and makes them marginally attached. Marginally attached. Now within this group of people, there are people who are marginally attached. Right? So we're going to start with saying they're marginally attached. But beyond that, they quit looking because of poor job prospects. They didn't find a job. So there's a lot of people who were looking in the last 12 months, but they stopped looking maybe because they said, I'm going to just spend more time with my kids. Or they stopped looking because they're taking care of grandma, or because they blah, 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 right? Whatever reason. They say, I'd like a job, but I quit looking in the last 6 months ago because I'm going to stay home and develop a hobby. Well, that person is not discouraged. A discouraged worker is a marginally attached worker who actually stopped looking because they couldn't find any jobs. They gave up. And again, we care about this group because it's like that tells us that there is something really rotten, right? If people are giving up looking for jobs, that's a bad sign. But we could get them back into the labor force pretty easily is what we think. Now, an important aspect of all of this is how we calculate the unemployment rate and something called the participation force. I butchered that. The labor force participation rate. So there's the labor force participation, and all that is the civilian labor force divided by the total population, right? And for the United States, it's roughly 65%. I'd have to go back and double check. Now, there's a whole bunch of other folks who could be in the labor force but aren't, is what that's saying. About 35% of people are not in the labor force. Now, within the labor force, right, so within this, you have the unemployment rate, right, the unemployment rate, and we'd say that is the number of unemployed people, this group, divided by the civilian labor force. And that's the unemployment rate. So the unemployment rate is just these people. It doesn't include marginally attached or discouraged or any of these other people. And it doesn't include Peters. The unemployment rate is just the unemployed out of the civilian labor force. So we could see that this might understate the level of unemployment. So here's some things to think about. Right? First is, it's an indicator. It's the indicator of how easy it is to find a job, but it's not a great picture of the whole economy, just like GDP. UE can understate or overstate the true level of unemployment. It doesn't include, and it does include certain people, for example. So if you have lots and lots of people who are part-time for economic reasons, that means that those people are counted as employed, right? Peters are counted as employed, so they don't count against us. So maybe the UE is not high enough, right? But if we have lots and lots of people who say, oh, forget it, I'm out of this unemployed group, I don't want to be unemployed anymore, and they just quit looking, that could actually make the unemployment rate better. And so we find that the UE rate here doesn't always state the true level of unemployment. Now, there are some other measures of unemployment. I'd be remiss if I didn't tell you that what we're describing up here is called U3 unemployment. That's actually what this is. It's U3. And there are 6 measures of unemployment, and multiples of which take into account these other folks. And if you spend some time on FRED, our Friendly Neighborhood Federal Reserve Economic Data, you will see those other unemployment rates on there. So they're not hidden. It also doesn't reflect demography. We find that African American, Hispanic, and young people have higher unemployment rates than the national average. And we have one last thing to note, is that GDP and unemployment are related in many cases. We find that if GDP goes up, we usually note that unemployment goes down. And likewise, if GDP goes down, we usually find unemployment goes up. And that's kind of what this is telling us here. So hopefully this helps you understand some of the basics, that's the terminology, and what an unemployment rate is. By the way, the unemployment rate for the United States is right about 3.7%. And hopefully this helps you understand a little bit of that. I'll see you next time.